Okay, so welcome everyone to our second CI Business Talk. Today we are with you, Daria Saxida Bogatay and Asia Spock. We are representative of the Confucius Institute Ljubljana, and we are really grateful that our speaker today is Mr. Alberto Gabriele, and we will talk about progressive taxation. So before we start, I just have a few technicalities for you. Firstly, that this event will be held for 60 minutes, 45 minutes of lecture and 15 minutes of Q&A. I suggest that we save all the questions to the end in order to have an event the most smooth as possible. As you also may notice, this event is recorded, so later on you will also receive the link and we will also publish on our social media. Now, in order not to lose more time, I would just like to ask our speaker to introduce himself and also start with the event. Mr. Gabriele, the floor is yours.
Yes. Yeah, good morning. I'm Alberto Gabriele, and I'm basically a development economist. I studied in Italy and in the London School of Economics, and I specialized on development economics. I worked with in NGOs, consulting companies, and then for many years with different United Nations agencies. I was in many places, and in particular in New York, in Mexico, in Geneva, in Cuba, and so on and so forth. And I retired a few years ago, and in the last 10, 15 years, I focus mainly on the so-called socialist market economies, but also on Cuba, which is not a socialist market economy. And so I focus mainly on China, Vietnam, and Cuba, and their economic model, their successes, and their contradictions. A few years ago, I co-authored with Haider Khan and Francesco Schettino a paper that eventually was published in a journal, Polarization and the Middle Class in China, a non-parametric evaluation using these are two databases. And among us, Schettino is he's a professor in Naples, and he's the one with the best statistic and econometric skills. I am not, although I know something about it, so I will not put the focus of this exposition of this lecture on the technical side. So what we found, what is already well known is that China had record economic growth, and this growth from a distributional viewpoint had one good side and one bad side. The good side is that it has been inclusive. All social groups, even the poorest one, experience some kind of sizable improvement in their welfare. But it has also been accompanied by an increase in both inequalities and polarization. Inequality, well, more or less is well known what inequality means. The concept of polarization needs some more specification. And for polarization, we mean the hollowing out of the national middle class, in the sense that the distribution becomes less equal. The distributional curve changes, and you get more people who are rich, more people who are poor, and fewer in the middle. So the central design of the country's income distribution function becomes smaller. And that's what we call the national middle class. I will explain now what does it mean, why I say national. So, and there is a corresponding flattening of the highest and lowest parts of the distribution. On the other hand, given the fact that all the Chinese were becoming richer in absolute terms, many Chinese joined the ranks of the global middle class, which means those people who are more or less in the middle of the distribution from a world viewpoint. So it's important to consider that the concept of the global middle class is very different from the concept of the national middle class. So recent trends that we have been analyzing show that inequality, both inequality and polarization, appear to have peaked in the mid to the late 2000s. There has been a mild equalizing trend until the mid 2010s, and then it's unclear what happened, because some elements, some statistical elements suggest that there has been again a trend inversion, but some other ones not. But what is sure, what is intuitive about happened after we finish this paper is that these negative distributional trends, which are already apparent, must have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, and probably now by the overall impact of the Ukraine war. So, as it is normal, we don't have hard and very reliable data for the last years. So, in general, the picture is that there has been increasing inequality and polarization since the 80s, and that this trend is not as bad as it was now, but it's unclear what happened in the last 5, 6, 7 years. And the Chinese leadership has not been blind to this phenomena, and realizes that something has to be done to fight excessive inequality and polarization. In the paper, we concluded that this inequality and polarization also posed political problems. And as growth is likely to slow down over time, if the polarizing forces were left unchecked, the social situation might worsen in the near future, increasing the risk of distributional and related conflicts. So we said, contrarily, anti-polarization measures are thus warranted, along with other policies aimed at achieving a more egalitarian growth pattern. And then, we don't pretend that Xi Jinping acted after he read our paper, but in 2021, there is this quote that Xi Jinping said, "Achieving common prosperity is not just an economic issue. It's a major political matter bearing on the party's foundation for rule. We cannot let an unbridgeable gulf appear between the rich and the poor." So, in our view, the PRC, the China, is a market socialist socioeconomic formation. Of course, all these words have a precise meaning and must be interpreted in a non-dichotomic and not non-sectarian or hyper-ideologic fashion. So China is, in our view, the most advanced member, Now I'm talking for myself, so I don't imply that Schettino and Kahn have exactly the same ideas. We work on that paper on a specific issue. Now I'm talking for myself. Is the most advanced member of a new class of market socialist socioeconomic formations that has been in existence since about 4 decades. 4 decades is not a long time in the long durée of history, but it's already enough to pinpoint to some structural characteristics that are interesting. And it's a mixed, what's market socialism? It's a mixed system pivoted on the dialectic, yet relatively harmonic coexistence of different modes of production, among which the socialist one is dominant. Of course, you cannot prove mathematically that the socialist mode of production is dominant in China. This is a holistic opinion, which can be informed opinion, which can be shared or not by all observers, by the other observers. In this model, the state does not relinquish its hegemony and leadership role, but it allows the emergence of some capitalist relations of production and exchange in some areas of the economy in order to improve the overall outcome of the economic development process. In such a way, capitalists play a limited yet useful role in the overall framework of the state-led socialist-oriented development strategy. All this happens in a framework where market relations are very important, although the market is not totally the king of the economy, but market compatibility is an important necessary condition for the functioning of this system. Market compatibility basically means that you cannot push the hubris of the planners to the point of ignoring basic market relations. So in such a situation, we saw that it's sure that this kind of system has produced a lot of economic growth, but it's not exempt of contradictions. So, and one of the contradictions is that, as we saw, there was an increase in inequality. So what can be done? In our view, there has been in China, also in Vietnam, an underutilization of traditional pro-equality policies that have been for a long time have been employed in the West, and particularly in the golden years of the social democratic of the social democratic history. So for instance, in northern countries, or even in countries like Italy, France, and even the United States. And so progressive taxation of income and wealth has played a very important role in diminishing inequality and class contradictions in the advanced Western countries in the past. Now it's been dismantled under the neoliberal hegemony, but it still has a role even in countries like Italy that are becoming more and more unequal. On the other hand, in socialist countries, for various reasons, this policy tool has been implemented to a very limited extent. So, which means that its untapped potential is huge. Under market socialism, in our view, progressive taxation can be even more effective than under capitalism, because under capitalism, the political economic context is weakened by the political power of the rich. So, in principle, there is a lot that can be gained by applying and intensifying progressive taxation in countries like China or Vietnam. So that's why we use this metaphor Piketty in Beijing to mean our core thesis. The path towards building, consolidating, and upgrading socialism in the 21st century necessarily implies a blending or coupling of the presently existing Chinese model and the revived version of the traditional social democratic model. That's why we talk, which we refer to as Piketty's way. So the presently existent market socialism is an important step forward in the history of humankind development, but it's structurally not endowed with the capability to fully satisfy many key socialist final goals, because public, in our view, public ownership of means of production is sufficient. It's not is necessarily a component of socialism, but it's not sufficient as a tool to achieve a satisfactory level of equality. Because first, you cannot have 100% public ownership of means of production, otherwise you end up like Cuba or the Soviet Union. On the other hand, even if it's strongly dominant and prevalent, and the principle of to each according to her work is amply realized, which is the basic socialist distributional principle, inequality would be still too much to be acceptable according to socialist-inspired ethical principles. Of course, here we're going beyond economics and touching the domain of ethics and principles, which nevertheless is important and must be taken into account. I personally do not believe in economics as pure mathematics and as a science that is a form of pure science that is independent from moral and ethical considerations. So we think that those countries that follow a market socialist path should borrow from the social democratic tradition and apply strong progressive taxation on income and wealth, including inheritance. So let's talk about some technicalities of progressive taxation. I already mentioned that as a tool is in general at least moderately effective under capitalism, although of course there is a discussion about it. This applies to all forms of taxation, i.e. income taxation, wealth taxation, inheritance taxation. Not surprisingly, this tool, progressive taxation, is potentially more effective in large and sovereign countries. For instance, in the US, it can be more effective than in a small country, because if a country is small and weak, it's more difficult to capture the incomes and the wealth of the rich, because they're more international and they just buy dollars, they transfer the money elsewhere, and so the potential is lower. The potential of this tool is lower in small and dependent countries. And this is one example more of the inequality of the world and of the additional difficulties that small and dependent countries, especially in the South, face in any domain of their policies, their political problems, and their strive to achieve inclusive development. So in practice, the broadly political dimension of progressive taxation is very important. It cannot be considered just as a technical tool. Under capitalism, the rule is that the national bourgeoisie, often in alliance with foreign bourgeoisies, is powerful enough to severely undercut the effectiveness of progressive taxation. This, in principle, should not be the case under market socialism. So, and this, in theory, we can also argue that progressive taxation has not been used very much under market socialism so far, also because of the old Marxist presumption that the absence of private property and socialization of means of production eliminates the Marxian inequality. What is the Marxian inequality? It is the basic form of inequality that you have between capitalists and proletarians. So in a mechanical and simplified interpretation of Marx, once you have socialized the means of production, you don't have more inequality. Of course, this is a very silly way to say a very complex problem. I will leave this other story for another time. So our view is that, broadly speaking, progressive taxation can be very effective under market socialism, and not only it could be the future, but it's becoming more and more urgent. On one hand, as the rich exist, but they're not hegemonic, there should be a configuration of political strength such that the leadership can be more effective in applying progressive taxation than under capitalism. On the other hand, it can be tailored in such a way as to minimize its negative impact on overall productivity and growth, with different tools such as incentives and so on. More so than traditional and unsophisticated command economy style tools, such as wage and price caps, limitations and prohibitions that constrain the flexibility of economic agents. So not only can progressive taxation can be effective under market socialism, but giving some more priority to progressive taxation and some lower priority to traditional administrative tools can also improve economic growth. So, to use a Chinese traditional expression, we should try to walk with two legs. So the progressive taxation in the direct, well, this is something I have to introduce the concept of productive macro sector. The productive macro sector is the one where some exchange value and the surplus is produced. So it's basically the sector where most commodities and services are produced and sold to the market. In this area, you have to consider that what is broadly referred to as the law of value, LV, is very important. So in this sector, the potential for progressive taxation is important, but it's constrained by the needs of increasing productivity and production. On the other hand, it's also very important to expand the non-market provision of basic and even less basic services and goods in the other productive macro sector, which is basically the public sector. So as a way to tackle inequality and polarization, progressive taxation is useful, but it's also important to expand and improve health, public education, and this kind of things. So in theoretical terms, this is called the expansion of the non-productive sector. Again, underline that the non-productive sector is non-productive of surplus. By no means it means it's not productive of welfare. So this is what I said before, that it's important that the state is able to capture more and more of the overall surplus produced by the society and to channel it towards important basic and less basic services, and even in some cases the distribution of goods in a way that is not the market way, but according to a criterion that is based on the needs of the people and not on their ability to buy on the market. This is also another tool to increase overall equality and to avoid polarization. So in recent times, we know that Xi and his comrades have launched with great vigor the common prosperity slogan. So like all these Chinese slogans, it has to be interpreted, and it's not a black and white kind of thing. When they sustain common prosperity, they also say that this does not mean robbing the rich to give to the poor in the Robin Hood fashion, or reverting to Maoist kind hyper-egalitarianism. But nevertheless, this is a real left turn towards more socialism within the already established market socialist mixed model, which with this very bad word means in this kind of change towards the left does not mean that that China is becoming something different from what it has been basically in the last 40 years, which is a market-oriented or market socialist socioeconomic formation, SEF. For socioeconomic formation, we mean a certain kind of system that prevails for a long period of time in a country or in some more countries. So, and in this framework, it's important to find against well, I use this trick to say against anti-socialist capitalism and anti-socialist capitalism. So that's why we have these contradictions between the Communist Party and Jack Ma and Alibaba, that these monopolies, they have become too arrogant, speculators, private tutoring, video games. So there is a repressive element in this left-wing turn that, in my view, is absolutely necessary. And there has been a lot of talk about introducing a property tax, which, of course, would be probably the most important progressive tax in a country like China, where property is very undertaxed. And it was supposed to be launched to a certain, with more strength this year. But then with all the mess and the COVID problems coming up again, and the overall very unclear situation, both domestically and internationally, the Communist Party has decided so far to be very, very cautious and to not to apply the new property tax on a very widespread level, but to be even more cautious than before, especially because there is the reasonable worry that this tax could, in the short to medium term, exacerbate the big problems that are already faced by the real estate sector. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Gabriele, for your contribution and time. Maybe we should start with questions. Do we have any questions?